All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Lipkin. I'm the NC Pingree Director of the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you today to the presentation, Crayon Rebellion, the Material Politics of North American Pastels, 1758 to 1812, with our 2022 Francis E. Malamy Research Fellow at the Phillips Library, Megan Baker. And Corey, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the title slide, it'd be great. Thank you. Thanks so much to all of you for choosing to spend some time with us this evening. And just a quick note that closed captioning for tonight's program is available by selecting that option on your Zoom toolbar. So I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the Peabody Essex Museum and the Phillips Library are on the ancestral territory of the Agawam, Pawtucket, Nomkeek, Massachusetts, and Wampanoag. Many other Indigenous communities have lived and moved through this place over hundreds of generations, and Indigenous people from many nations live and work in our region today. So please join us in honoring their communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. Thank you. And if you haven't had a chance, you may want to take some time to visit the museum and check out our fairly newly reinstalled galleries of American and Native American art. They're really wonderful. So I'd like to take an opportunity to offer our very special thanks to Michael Malamy and his children, Jocelyn and Adam, who funded this annual fellowship in 2007 as a lasting tribute to Francis. And Francis had deep roots within the library. A longstanding member of the museum family, she dedicated tireless hours processing manuscripts in our collection. She was an extraordinary individual who believed that the Phillips Library provides value to the academic community and to the public. And she realized the importance of our fantastic collection and its potential impact on the greater intellectual world. Many, many thanks are due to our PEM colleagues for pulling this together and helping to make it happen, especially Bethany Beatrice Gravel, Chip Van Dyke, Corey Dodge, and our creative services, guest experience, and marketing teams. And of course, to Megan for sharing her research and her knowledge with us. So just a bit of housekeeping. Everyone's muted and cameras are off. I mean, we do encourage questions, and feel free to submit them via the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can in the final portion of the program. And a recording of tonight's program will be posted on PEM's YouTube channel, and we'll share that link with you when it goes live. Should be a couple of days. And at this point, I'd like to welcome to the screen Jennifer Hornsby, Phillips Library's Reference and Access Services Librarian, to introduce Megan and to start the program. I'm really grateful for Jen's hard work managing our fellowship programs and for her outstanding supervision and guidance of all of our reference services. So Jen, please join us.
Thanks so much, Dan. I would also like to thank Michael Malamy and his family for the support of the fellowship. The fellowship program is exciting for the library as we get to read many great proposals, learn about new topics, and also provide ourselves with insight into new ways our collections can be interpreted. For listeners that are interested, the Phillips Library administers the Francis E. Malamy Fellowship on an annual basis. We usually put the call out for applications in late summer with a deadline of around November 1st. And we welcome you to follow our social media accounts on Twitter and Instagram for the announcements. So tonight we are excited to welcome Megan Baker, who is a PhD candidate in art history and UDEL Distinguished Graduate Scholar at the University of Delaware, where her work primarily focuses on art and material culture of the 18th century Atlantic world. Megan's research addresses drawing practice and education, the movement of artistic supplies and techniques, the French presence in North America, the interactions between politics and aesthetics in the age of revolutions, and art's relationship to violence. Her dissertation, which you'll hear more about, considers the ascendant popularity of pastel portraits in late 18th century British North America and the inter-imperial trade and resource extraction necessary for the medium to flourish. Megan holds a BA in art history from Columbia University and an MA in the history of art from Williams College, where her qualifying paper explored how Francois Boucher's artistic practice facilitated misunderstandings of the artist's style with enduring repercussions. She previously held curatorial positions at the Clark Art Institute and the Williams College Museum of Art. When she's not thinking about pastels, Megan enjoys playing board games, especially one with historical themes, and making both clothes and furniture. In fact, she once attended a Halloween party as a pastel of Abigail Adams in a dress she made herself, which naturally won the costume contest. So I'd like to welcome Megan to the screen.
Thank you, Jen and Dan. So first, I would like to extend my thanks to the Malamy family and to the entire Phillips Library staff. It was such a pleasure to work in the Phillips Library while doing this research, and I am very honored to have been the 2022 recipient. I would also like to thank Sarah Chassie at the Peabody Essex Museum, who has supported this research since it was in its infancy and has helped so much to make it possible. A deceptively simple question has fueled my dissertation research. Why did pastel portraits become popular in colonial America during the lead up to the American Revolution? A huge number of pastel portraits were produced in North America during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but little scholarship has addressed them either individually or collectively. As a medium for making portraits, pastel is a bit unusual. Pastel, or crayon, drawing and painting rose to prominence in France at the beginning of the 18th century and subsequently became fashionable in British circles. Throughout the 17th century, artists often worked à trois crayons, producing drawings with black, white, and red chalks on toned paper. This practice evolved to include dry sticks called crayons or pastels, made of ground pigment, a dusty filler such as chalk, and a binding agent. Artists began using these fabricated color chalks to paint in the mid-17th century, as did a growing body of non-professional practitioners. From the 1720s onward, pastel painting flourished in France as a new generation of artists devoted themselves to the medium. Because pastel allowed for rich depictions of different textures, it was particularly apt for representing luxury materials which proliferated in the 18th century. Yet pastel's burgeoning popularity and ephemerality sparked debates over its status as a fine art in both France and Great Britain. French critics attacked the medium, faulting its fragility and propensity to decay. In Great Britain, pastels never reached the same level of acclaim as in France. British grand tourists had pastel portraits taken in Rome, and some artists worked in the medium after returning from the continent, but relatively few professional English artists became pastelists. By the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, British artist pastel use waned because of stylistic associations with their imperial rivals, the French, as well as prejudice from public figures. The president of the British Royal Academy of Arts, Sir Joshua Reynolds, discouraged artists from working in the medium, dismissing it as, quote, just what ladies do when they paint for amusement, end quote, and chastising the Boston-born John Singleton Copley to stop making pastels. Curiously, its decline in Europe signaled the medium's spread across the Atlantic and ascent in the North American colonies. The conclusion of the 7 Years' War and increasing trade with North America opened opportunities for artists to travel. The arrival of larger numbers of British, Dutch, Swiss, and especially French pastelists and their itinerant movements across the North American continent demonstrates the influence of transatlantic actors in disseminating this medium. As my research illuminates, and as you see here, first in Massachusetts and then throughout the colonized continent, crayon images gained widespread favor during the American Revolution and into the early Republic, as individuals embraced the medium regardless, or in some instances, perhaps because of its association with Francophone tastes. Quick production time, affordability, and relatively portable dimensions provided the pastel with advantages in a transatlantic world, allowing for easy movement at a precarious time of shipboard travel. My dissertation looks at artists who worked in pastel between the 1750s and the 18-teens, a period that forms what I view as the pastel's early lifespan in the Americas. I consider artists who were working in different ports throughout North America, including Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Salem. The first chapter addresses John Singleton Copley, who produced pastel portraits from 1758 through his departure for London in 1774. Copley made upwards of 80 pastels in North America, and my research, which builds on important contributions by the art historians Diana Sieve-Greenwald and Nika Elder, suggests that over 80% of his pastel sitters were members of families that were enslavers or were involved in the sale of enslaved people. This percentage is about 20% higher than with Copley's oil on canvas portraits, suggesting pastels may have held a certain allure for patrons involved with enslavement, like Copley and his wife, pictured here. The second chapter, which we will spend some more time talking about shortly, looks to Salem and the pastelists who worked here, especially members of the Blythe family. It investigates the materials necessary to produce pastels and the role of maritime trade in the procurement of those supplies. It also explores the role of French identity in the spread of pastels in colonial North America, and why a French style might be an appropriate form of political resistance during the American Revolution. It also analyzes the pastel portrait's place within the decorative interior for Salem's inhabitants, both Black and white. Finally, the chapter presents the pedagogic value of pastel as a medium, as the medium was taught as part of a curriculum at schools for a polite education. My third chapter continues to think about pastel's educational potential, introducing the Swiss-born artist-naturalist Pierre-Eugène de Cimetier, who settled in Philadelphia and documented his extensive travels across North America and the Caribbean. Moving beyond pastel's role in elite portraiture, this chapter explores pastel's use in natural history and the related coercion of knowledge from enslaved and indigenous peoples. Du Cimetier produced pastel portraits, of which there are no known finished examples, to stay financially solvent while pursuing his true passion, research for a publication totalizing all known North American history in text and image. While the publication was never realized, much of his extensive documentation for it survives, materials which reveal his use of pastel in pursuit of this Enlightenment project. The final chapter looks at two traveling European artists, the exiled French aristocrat, Charles Balthazar Julien Février de Saint-Amand, and the British-born James Sharples, who both produced profile portraits while working in the United States between the 1790s and the 18-teens. These two portraitists each produced hundreds of images of individuals, many of whom played prominent political roles in the colonial and early national periods. Economic precarity drove these artists to their profession as portraitists, and their respective approaches demonstrate the divergent pastel practices that began to develop during the early national period in the United States. So when I started my research at the Phillips Library, I had a lot of questions. Salem's relationship to pastels is unique. The overwhelming majority of portraits made in 18th century North America were oil on canvas paintings like these, and Salemites enthusiastically commissioned them. There were at least 39 oil portraits of Salem residents made between 1749 and 1763, painted by artists including John Smibert, Robert Feek, John Greenwood, Joseph Badger, Joseph Blackburn, and John Singleton Copley. There is very little overlap between the families that already owned oil portraits and the families that commissioned pastels between the 1760s and the 1780s. And notably, the only oil portraits being made during that time are produced by artists who also worked in pastel or who more frequently worked in pastel. So what brought about this shift? In part, there were very few oil painters. Art academies did not yet exist on this side of the Atlantic and would not begin in earnest until the early 19th century. Most of the artists who had been producing portraits either passed away or left North America, so that by the mid-1760s, Copley was pretty much in a league of his own in New England. That fact, alongside his skill, made Copley extremely busy and his portraits increasingly expensive. So, the rise of pastel in Massachusetts seems at least partially connected to the dearth of oil painters throughout the American Revolution. But the patron class, who used portraits as a sign of their social and cultural standing, still desired objects that announced their gentility. So artists began to work more and more in pastel. When looking at pastels made in Essex County, of which the Peabody Essex Museum has a substantial collection, a variety of techniques and approaches can be seen. They show signs of different materials being used at different moments. Because pastels are such fragile objects, damaged examples are primary documents that reveal as much, if not more than, ones in pristine condition. They reveal how the artist approached making the artwork. I suspect the shift toward pastels also occurred because of non-importation agreements and warfare limiting the availability of supplies, including paper, paint, pigment, and glass. Pastel portraits traditionally used blue paper as a support when available, in part because the tone provided contrast to emphasize white skin. The same blue paper enfolded sugar cones for sale in Europe and North America, with the contrast of blue paper against white sugar participating in the same optical program. Some examples made in North America also use blue paper. For instance, John Singleton Copley used it in his portrait of Governor John Wentworth, and Benjamin Blythe used it in his depictions of Captain Joseph White and his wife Elizabeth, all three of which were made around 1770. But paper was a critical commodity during this time. First, imported paper was heavily taxed in the Revenue Acts of 1767, which also taxed other artistic supplies, including paint and pigment. While non-importation agreements ceased in 1770, the availability of paper and other materials remained precarious, especially once warfare began in 1775. Facing these constraints, Salem's Benjamin Blythe improvised. He mimicked the effects of blue paper by rubbing blue crayon on laid paper, and you can see an example of that here. One of my project's big questions is how individuals acquired both technical and embodied knowledge about pastels. And Blythe's self-produced blue paper is one reason for that interest. Where were artists getting these supplies? How were they learning to apply crayon to paper? What struggles did they face in making pastel artworks? Why did they even pursue pastel in the first place? What role did regional stylistic preferences play in the taste for pastels? And what caused those preferences? What was the role of patronage, of Salem's extensive maritime reach, and of both individual and cultural networks? My fellowship time was spent digging into material to try and address these questions. Phillips Library holds many manuscript collections that provided some pieces of evidence. Chief among them are the Derby family papers, which contain documents pertaining to Richard Derby, a merchant who started a very successful shipping business, as well as two of his sons, Elias Haskett and John, as well as subsequent generations. 5 pastel portraits depicting members of the Derby family by the Blythes are known today. 4 of them are at Salem Maritime National Historic Site, installed in the Elias Haskett Derby House, while 1, that of Haskett, is at Penn. As other scholarship has demonstrated, Derby family members came to occupy prominent social and political positions in Salem during the second half of the 18th century, as they became leaders in the town's maritime trade. Derby ships brought a wide variety of goods to Salem. I hope to find both signals of the family's aesthetic preferences, as well as any indication that they imported some of the materials necessary for the fabrication of pastels. What I found was a nebulous mix of documents that underscored the diversity of social relationships in Salem and their transgenerational nature. I found a lot of evidence of interactions between people and longstanding dealings between different families. For instance, the Derby and Blythe families frequently interacted. Both families settled in Salem during the 17th century, and they had clear reasons for business dealings. While Richard Derby's ships imported a wide variety of goods, Samuel Blythe Sr., the father of the artists Benjamin and Samuel, was a sailmaker, a very skilled craftsman whose work enabled Salem's ships to make the voyages that brought goods back from afar. Blythe appears in Derby ledgers from the 1750s onward, regularly purchasing rum, cotton, and duck or canvas fabric, chocolate, molasses, sugar, rice, oil, wine, and occasionally other household consumer goods like knives, handkerchiefs, and garlic. Samuel Sr. and Richard had a very active business relationship. Samuel appears in ledgers as many as 8 times in a single month, and it's easy to imagine any of Blythe's sons, Samuel, Benjamin, Varon, or William, venturing with their father to make these purchases, a fact that the ledger testifies to. Ledgers often include information about who was doing the purchasing on an account, if it wasn't the actual account holder, as a sort of insurance measure. So for instance, on July 24th, 1761, Derby charged £2 to Blythe's account for sundry goods on his, quote, son's orders to a Frenchman. Earlier research has established that the Blythes seem to have been part of the French-speaking diaspora within Essex County. While Salem is most frequently associated in the popular imagination with the 1692 witchcraft incident, the town was far from a Puritan stronghold, and over the 18th century was gaining a reputation for the wealth of its residents. Many merchants and artisans came to Massachusetts with non-Puritan backgrounds and were not seeking religious favor, but financial. A very active portion of this community were French speakers from the Isle of Jersey, called Jersey French, who were largely Anglican migrants seeking economic opportunities. This group included the Blythe family. How did the Blythes come to work in pastel? The historian Henry Wilder Foote first speculated that Blythe's familiarity with pastels came from Copley's use of the medium in nearby Boston, and no alternatives have been suggested by subsequent scholars. My suspicion is instead that they became familiar with the medium through one of these unnamed Frenchmen who appears scattered throughout town records. European mariners were frequently skilled draftsmen, and the pastel's ease of use made it suitable while traveling. One could efficiently make a color sketch using a crayon. In both Boston and Salem, Frenchmen often taught dance, sword dancing or fencing, and social niceties like the French language. Drawing instruction was frequently also a part of this polite education, so it would not be unreasonable for these same groups of educators to teach that. 2 Essex Gazette advertisements from 1772 show that Frenchmen Robert and Georges Vera offered themselves to all those that, quote, inclined to have themselves or their children taught in the genteel accomplishments of speaking French, music, fencing, and dancing, before lamenting that the 2 men were, quote, accidentally thrown into this town by misfortunes, end quote. A subsequent 1772 advertisement notes that the Monsieur de Vera will continue French and dancing school so long as enough students appeared, and asked those would-be students to go register at Mr. Blythe's. So the Blythe family was commercially aligned with French-born tutors in Salem, with both families marketing themselves to the town's upwardly mobile merchant class. It remains equally likely that the Blythes learned how to work in pastel through training manuals. Technical guides informed readers how to best fabricate their own supplies, as well as how to use them. The Salem Social Library was founded in 1760, and the Blythes had relationships with many members of the library. I spent time going through early records of the Salem Social Library and the slightly later Salem Philosophical Library, two institutions which ultimately combined to become the Salem Athenaeum. Library books were, in theory, exclusively for the use of members or their households, but the holdings help demonstrate the sort of material that Salemites were interested in reading. Books that deal with aesthetics are among the items in the catalogs, including William Hogarth's Analysis of Beauty, Jonathan Amos's Art of Printing, Dufresnoy's Art of Painting, Edmund Burke's Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of the Sublime and Beautiful, and Robert Dossey's Handmaid to the Arts, which contained recipes to fabricate pastels. Other documents in the Phillips Library helped me to better understand the books that individuals owned. Books they could have bought in Salem, either from a shop like that of stationer and bookseller Maskell Williams, or at auctions like this example from after Elias Haskett Derby's death, which shows the unbelievably French contents of his library. Newspaper advertisements demonstrate that Salem residents were actively sharing books, with obituary notices sometimes requesting the return of any books borrowed from the deceased. Despite Britain's imperial record-keeping strengths, the American War for Independence left many archival holes. I hoped that a combination of customs house records and shipping logs would help establish a clear lineage for the origin of various supplies. Unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of both Salem and Boston custom house records from the lead up to the American Revolution have been unlocated since at least the 19th century. And while there are some surviving records at the Phillips Library, none of them helped me to assess the source of materials like paper. Shipping logs and business records were more useful. Paper rarely appears listed as a good, and I think it's because it's often being included as a sundry good instead of being articulated as an individual import. The merchant Samuel Flagg's daybook, which we see here, was helpful in determining that, as he did individually itemize what sundry items he was selling, which helps illuminate the movement of paper. And so we see one ream here, as well as two quires of another size. Still, in February 1776, Elias Haskett Derby wrote to his captain, Nathaniel Sillisby, with orders for what he should seek to bring back to Salem from the West Indies, and how best to safely attempt the voyage amid the warfare. Derby expressly listed, quote, paper, and the good writing paper is much desired. A collection of auctioneers' sales books from 1776 to 1781 was also profoundly helpful. And so this is auctions from merchants, but also privateer auctions. And it documents the actual sale of a hugely diverse quantity of goods, including a fair amount of paint, likely for houses, ships, and signs, but also for other purposes, as well as home goods like cookware and servingware, furniture, mirrors, and books. I finally located blue paper in the account book of Jonathan Waldo, who documented the sale of it in 1774, which is the first time I found it recorded in Salem, even though the material is clearly here earlier. Newspaper records from the 1760s suggest some local paper mills were producing blue paper and often marketing it for sale to sugar bakers, though it was also being imported from abroad. The Apothecary Sales Book of William Stearns also documents the sale of blue paper from 1785 onward. In addition to paper and medical remedies, apothecaries like Stern and Waldo often sold crayons and other artistic supplies. Another earlier apothecary in Salem, Philip Godfrey Cast, advertised his sale of pigments and paint from the mid-1760s, offering chalk, red lead, white lead, stone yellow, vermilion, and other painters' colors, as well as gold and silver leaf, materials which could have been used to fabricate pastel with the simple addition of a binding agent like milk or oatmeal, as manuals like Robert Dossey's laid out. Cast was subsequently publicly shamed for having imported a quantity of painters' colors in August of 1769, after the non-importation agreement following the Revenue Act of 67, suggesting he thought there was substantial enough profit potential to do so despite any other social or political consequences. Samuel Blythe Jr. also engaged in the sale of artistic supplies and was likely getting them from contacts in Boston. Samuel Blythe was a painter in its several branches, making heraldic coats of arms, painting houses and ships, varnishing, lacquering, and gilding pieces of furniture. He was also a carver who made a harpsichord that is in Pem and is thought to have carved most of the frames for Salem's pastels. By the summer of 1771, he had opened a shop in the center of Salem at the intersection of present-day Essex and Washington streets, out of which he sold painters' colors, watercolors, and painting utensils of all sorts. It is likely this location where the Verrat brothers were teaching French classes, as Blythe himself opened a boarding school for young ladies in 1774. Just months after Samuel advertised the opening of his shop, his brother Benjamin announced his temporary availability for pastel services in Boston, where he was staying on the north side of the town hall, or what we would call the Old State House. On the same street, then called Queen Street, was John Gore's paint shop. Gore was also a heraldic painter who became a merchant and is the earliest known supplier of pastels in Massachusetts. He advertised the import of crayons and watercolors from London as early as 1761 and proclaimed them the best crayons in sets. He also sold mezzotints and plate glass for picture frames and other supplies for artists. Plate glass was especially important for pastels to protect them from any potential damage, which would alter their appearance. Gore was likely one of Copley's pastel suppliers, and the merchant commissioned Copley to paint a group portrait of his children in the 1750s, when the artist was just starting out. So Gore's shop is one of the places in Boston where artists are able to gather, and the other is John Smibert's former studio, and it's reasonable to assume that Blythe is familiar with both of these places. Incidentally, Blythe's time in Boston in December of 1771 coincided with Copley's extended trip to New York City, where he had been since summer. So the Salem artist may have attempted to take advantage of this timing. Nevertheless, Samuel Blythe and John Gore were close enough that Gore appointed Blythe one of the executors of his estate. Blythe was unable to fulfill this role because he too had recently passed away, but their respective probate records show large balances between the two men. Thus, the most likely source for Salem's pastels is Gore and his son Samuel, who took over the business. So let's return to the derbies, the 5 portraits of the derbies that I mentioned previously. They are rather unusual in that they remain installed in an original context, or a nearly original context. The portraits are very likely made in 1778, as Haskett and Elizabeth were starting to consider moving from the brick house by Derby Wharf, which they had occupied since the time of their marriage in 1761. Elizabeth was incredibly fashionable and interested in maintaining a well-decorated home. I suspect the decision to have portraits made and the choice for their medium to be pastel was entirely Elizabeth's, as she seems to have been in charge of the decorative scheme for all of the family's homes. I also suspect that the commission was made because of the children. The family papers contain a genealogy chart, which shows Haskett and Elizabeth lost an infant son, Henry, in the spring of 1776, and their last child, Richard, was born in January of 1777. Commissioning portraits, then, of the family's young children would be a natural way to both decorate the home and have a portrait of them should tragedy strike. While no portrait of the infant Richard is known today, it is likely one did at some point, as portraits of infants were becoming increasingly common in this period, and the Blythes made several. Samuel Blythe Jr. charged Darby 18 pounds for 6 frames of bois in August of 1778, presumably 6 wooden frames to encase the family's pastel portraits. Different Blythe pastels are in wildly different states of preservation, and I suspect this is because of fluctuating availability of imported crayons from Europe and the reliance on locally produced ones instead. So while more research is still needed, it seems that in the late 1770s, it's a time when commercially available pastels are largely unavailable, which may account for some of the technical variations that appear at this time, where there's so little pastel that actually remains on the artwork that it's not totally possible to tell what was originally going on. In addition to deciding that the family would have their portraits taken, it's likely that Elizabeth played a role in the decision to inoculate the children from smallpox at the same moment, the spring of 1778. So we can think of the portraits of Hersey and Nancy as being taken to commemorate this event, perhaps before it in case something went wrong, but also maybe after. In any case, on May 2nd, Elias and the 5 oldest children entered the Salem Inoculation Hospital, as did a man named Isaac, who was 21 and is noted in the inoculation record as E.H. Derby's. Isaac was not the only enslaved person to be inoculated that day. 37-year-old Primus, whom the Gardeners enslaved, and 15-year-old Boston, who the Wards enslaved, were also there. Everyone left successfully cured and now immune to a powerful illness that was active in Massachusetts approximately 20 days later. So it's long been known that Derby was an enslaver, and it seems he continued to hold people in bondage until his death in 1779, because the legal ending of slavery in Massachusetts in 1783 did not mean the factual end of slavery. Sabe and Rose are 2 people who Derby enslaved and whom appear on the family genealogy chart. Sabe, born in 1771, and no information given about Rose. Isaac is a new name, a new individual who also labored in and around the brick house adjacent to Derby Wharf. What was life in the brick house like for Isaac? What did he think about the debates regarding liberty and freedom that were sweeping the town? Did he consent to being inoculated, or was it done against his will? Both Elizabeth and Haskett grew up in houses with enslaved servants. A receipt and letter in the Derby family papers from 1775 document Richard's purchase of a boy for 34 pounds from merchants in Barbados, whom the merchants hoped would, quote, answer the end you want him for, and noting that they gave the captain, quote, 6 yards of cotton and a cap for the boy. Derby paid £1 import tax when the boy arrived in Salem in May, and he does not otherwise appear in the documentary record. A list of inhabitants from the previous year indicates approximately 3.5% of Salem's population, or 123 out of 3,462 residents, were Black and listed as members of other people's homes, so we can assume they were enslaved. Elizabeth's mother enslaved 3 people at the time of her death in 1773. And this is one of the things that I noticed while in the manuscripts the most, is that there's an abundance of evidence to the extent that slavery occurred in Salem in the 18th century. Salem's wealth was not only derived from the byproducts of human bondage, the huge quantities of rum and molasses and sugar entering and exiting the port, but also from the direct subjugation of individuals. There are so many instances of the use of enslaved labor and the sale of enslaved people in the documents town residents produced, especially in shop ledgers, where they often go nameless, referred to as the property of their enslaver while running errands on their behalf. These are the Salem stories that I want to encourage other young scholars to take interest in and help reveal, and the Phillips Library is filled with them. I am very grateful for this time spent learning more about the lives of Salem's residents and the material worlds they encountered and produced, and for the opportunity to think about the ways that these narratives disrupt this typical story told about Salem's labor force. Pastels are beautiful objects that would not exist without complicated and violent material histories. So again, thank you to the Phillips Library and the Malamy Fellowship for making this research possible. And I hope to share more of these important stories as my research on 18th century Salem continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions already lined up. I'm going to start with one from Pat. When working with pastels and crayons, how does or did the artist set the image so smudging didn't occur?
That's a great question. So they don't really is part of the problem. And so that's why pastels are so difficult as historical objects. So in the 18th century, artists and scientists are very actively trying to figure out how to fix pastels and how to make them stay in this sort of perfect, intriguing visual state forever, because pastels are sort of reliant on new ideas about optics, right? And the way that bright light is reflecting and refracting off of them. And so the desire to fix pastels is there from the beginning of their use, but all of the different approaches to fixing the pastel include pretty vile mixtures of egg yolks and different animal urines and sort of, just good old fashioned trying your best with materials to see what might work. And so they're using sort of proto glues that are effectively ruining the pastels and preventing them from looking as beautiful as they once did. And so later in time, in the 19th century, pastels become slightly more stable, but 18th century ones, often the process to try to fix them sort of ruins them.
How lovely to bring a urine-covered painting into your home.
I really want to try making some of these fixatives, but I'm kind of afraid to embark on it.
I can see why. So a huge thank you from one of our listeners for the great talk and sharing your dissertation research. And they would like to know what the most surprising research discoveries you made during your time at PEM were.
Actually, there were so many. I had such a good time going through all of the material that I went through. And I feel like the quantities of rum that were traveling through Salem was one moment that was, it was one of the first days that I was there. And I feel like I was just looking at ledger books that had 5,000 gallons of rum, 5,000 gallons of rum, every line item for like hundreds of pages. And so I was sitting there in the library Googling what a 5,000 gallon drum looks like and trying to like find one with a human scale to wrap my head around that. So as far as just material quantities and things that are difficult to sort of imagine, that was shocking to me. I realized, right, everyone realizes when you talk about colonial America that alcohol is a big part of it, but I guess the actual numbers and sort of a visualization of what that quantity of liquor looks like was something that I was glad to have actual numbers to sort of work with. But then other things were just delightful visually. I really enjoyed looking at school ledgers and seeing students sort of trying ciphering and penmanship. There's one really delightful mariner's textbook that's British, and so it didn't help me in my own quest here with American stuff, but it was fascinating to look at because there were really beautiful drawings, seascapes, and sort of practice topography drawings in it, which is something that is another interest of mine. So that was really fabulous. And then the Pickering interview with Gilbert Stuart that is in the library also was just a delight as someone who works on American art to sort of look at and see his little drawings of Stuart's descriptions of how much different paintings cost. It was a good time.
And for those of you who may have seen the social media posts regarding this talk, those Gilbert Stuart sketches were in there. So if you could just remind the audience why the artist preferred blue paper for the pastels.
Yeah, so blue paper is the thickest of the papers that's generally for sale in this time. So it's special in a couple ways. It's easier to adhere a thicker paper to a canvas. And so the ways that pastels are being made is you have a stretcher, a wooden stretcher that this canvas is then attached to, and they paste the paper onto it. And so it's paper attached to canvas generally, although in Salem you see a lot of paper attached to board, which sort of disintegrates differently. And so it's another fun piece of figuring out how artists are doing things here, at least as opposed to the official way of doing things. But so this blue paper is texturally advantageous, right? It's smoother, it has a little bit of a tooth to it, but it's not like laid paper, right? It doesn't have sort of the deep rivets in it. And it's also, so artists are building up different pigments on top of it, and it's providing an optical effect where it's sort of giving a blue sense beneath all of this. And so they're often using that to build up the background, but also the skin tone.
So another very gracious listener, thank you very much for bringing labor of all kinds into this conversation. Have you found any evidence of the blue sugar wrapping paper being reused? I'm thinking the triangulation between European paper production and sugar production in the Caribbean, and possible reuse for art objects, even possibly amateurs in Salem.
This is what I'm absolutely dying for, right? Or maybe I'm not, maybe it's more fun to speculate, but that would be an incredible piece of evidence to have. And I would absolutely love to see more information on that. But unfortunately, I'm dealing with objects that often have never been conserved, even when they are objects that are in the best repositories for them. They're just pastels, as I've said, are sort of finicky, and they are often in such states of disrepair by the time they get to a museum that they're not going to put any money into conserving them. And so a lot of the pieces that have had work done on them and sort of have conservation histories and people who are more knowledgeable about paper looking at them are by really proficient artists, right? So Copley has had technical analysis done, and I have seen no evidence that he is actually reusing paper that wrapped sugar. But I found a lot of scraps of blue paper at random instances throughout doing this work, not just at the Phillips, but in going through other archives, there's often just scraps of blue paper and things. And I'm assuming that those are refuse from sugar wrappers, right? Sort of like to make your quill go, or sort of get things going, scratch pad. So I hope that would be a fun find.
We have a question from a PEM employee, Sarah, thanking you, and of course, and such exciting research and discoveries, and wondering if you could speak to later transitions from pastels into watercolor later in the 18th century in Salem. Cornet in particular, possibly?
So yes, I'm really interested in why you see this not only in Salem. I think it has to do with the sudden commercial availability of pastel paper, or watercolor paper, excuse me. And so watercolor paper is starting to be produced in England at the Watman Mill at the end of the 18th century is when this really ramps up, at the very beginning, like 1800. And so there's a lot watercolor paper, or better sort of flat paper, right? It's a new technical process that's making paper that is not laid. And so it's easier for watercolors to be applied to. And so I think in part that's happening. And I think additionally, at least what I'm seeing elsewhere is there's a switch from pastel portraits being made to Physionotrace portraits being made in pastel. And so there's a device that's trying to take a profile outline of someone's face. And if you're not working in that medium, then I think that people are sort of finding pastures elsewhere that are more interesting to work in other media. Especially since art academies are starting to appear in America in the early 19th century, people, it seems, are moving away from pastel, and it's becoming feminized, sort of becoming associated with something that schoolgirls are working in, and watercolor sort of suffers the same fate to some extent, but you also see it just being used as a more educational tool.
So we have another listener who was wondering if there were any women at the time, specifically in Salem, that were producing pastel portraits as part of their social training or as a professional artist.
So I've not come across, I can't name anyone, but I have strong suspicions that this is occurring. There are a number, especially the late 18th, early 19th century, you have a number of young ladies who are becoming very proficient in the arts in Salem. But women are practicing pastel both in America earlier than this. So the first pastelist who's working in North America is a woman named Henrietta Johnson, who's sort of an anomaly. She's probably born in France to parents who moved to London, and then she ends up marrying very well and moves to Ireland. Her husband dies and she ends up remarrying a guy who is sent to South Carolina, and he is habitually not paid. And so she starts making pastel portraits to sort of supplement the family's income. And she's working in the so from about 1708 until the 1720s, mostly in South Carolina. She makes a trip to New York, and then the medium sort of disappears. And so I think there's definitely women who are working in this medium throughout the period, and it's finding any evidence of who they were.
Of course. So thanks again. Love to hear more about pastel and mourning. Is there a relationship between the medium and more metaphorical ideas about death? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'm going to have to think about that more, because I only really made that realization as I was going through everything in a sort of frantic, right? The dates line up and you're like, oh, wow. But I think Benjamin Blythe, there's an oil portrait that he made that shows a grave behind the sitter, and it's a grave of his wife. And so I think there's certainly an interest in mourning ritual by the artists involved here. And I think there's a close association too between pastel and miniature painting. So you're frequently seeing artists who are working in one, working in the other, and mourning mourning rituals have close associations with miniature paintings. And so I'll have to think more about sort of the ephemerality of pastel and the mourning practices. I can see there's sort of maybe a poetic, the portrait will destroy itself with time, as so does time destroy the individual. But I hadn't gotten there yet myself, so I'll have to think some more.
And do you have a favorite pastel artist?
Oh, well, yes, but no one who's working in North America, I must admit. So the French pastelists are the absolute best, and I love Maurice Quentin de la Tour. He's sort of the rock star of it. His portrait of Madame de Pompadour is very, very large. It's multiple sheets. It's exceptionally proficient. I like when people are very good at using pastel. I also like it when they're not very good at using pastel.
Excellent. Well, I think that wraps up our questions. And so I'd like to thank you again for your time, and the audience as well for joining us this evening. And a reminder that we are recording this, and we will be sending out the link to those in attendance. shortly.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Megan, so much. It's so great to have such an interesting topic being worked on here in the library. And I think maybe you've given us a new tagline for the library, which is a nebulous mix of documents. I really like that from, when you're talking about the Derby paper. So really fascinating. Thank you so much for being a fellow with us this year. It was really enjoyable. And thanks to the Malamy family, of course. I'm going to drop a link in here to a survey if you're interested in giving us feedback on this program. We'd love to hear it. And Megan, thanks again. And I'm really appreciative of your call to other researchers to help us explore some of the other hidden stories in our collections. I think there's a lot of
those
potential.
inoculation records. I'm someone who is more of a historian than me will have an absolute field day with them. So
yeah, they really are. Yeah, thank you for that. So thanks again, everybody. Congratulations, Megan, and looking forward to seeing the fruits of your labor and your dissertation and whatever else comes for you in the future.
thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.